3.2.1 Functions of Language. Learning objectives. Identify and discuss the four main types of linguistic expressions. Discuss the power of language to express our identities, affect our credibility, control others, and perform actions. Discuss some of the sources of fun within language. Explain how neologisms and slang contribute to the dynamic nature of language. Identify the ways in which language can separate people and bring them together. What utterances make up our daily verbal communication? Some of our words convey meaning, some convey emotions, and some actually produce actions. Language also provides endless opportunities for fun because of its limitless, sometimes nonsensical, and always changing nature. In this section, we will learn about the 5 functions of language, which shows us that language is expressive, language is powerful, language is fun, language is dynamic, and language is relational. Heading: Language is expressive. Verbal communication helps us meet various needs through our ability to express ourselves. In terms of instrumental needs, we use verbal communication to ask questions that provide us with specific information. We also use verbal communication to describe things, people, and ideas. Verbal communication helps us to inform, persuade, and entertain others, which, as we will learn later, are 3 general purposes of public speaking. It is also through our verbal expressions that our personal relationships are formed. At its essence, language is expressive. Verbal expressions help us communicate our observations, thoughts, feelings, and needs. Heading: Expressing observations. When we express observations, we report on the sensory information we are taking or have taken in. Eyewitness testimony is a good example of communicating observations. Witnesses are not supposed to make judgments or offer conclusions. They only communicate factual knowledge as they experienced it. For example, a witness could say, "I saw a white Mitsubishi Eclipse leaving my neighbor's house at 10:30 p.m." As we learned in the chapter titled Communication and Perception, observation, and description, occur in the first step of the perception checking process. When you are trying to make sense of an experience, expressing observations in a descriptive rather than an evaluative way can lessen defensiveness, which facilitates competent communication. Heading: Expressing thoughts. When we express thoughts, we draw conclusions based on what we have experienced. In the perception process, this is similar to the interpretation step. We take various observations and evaluate and interpret them to assign them meaning, a conclusion. Whereas our observations are based on sensory information, what we saw, what we read, what we heard. Thoughts are connected to our beliefs, what we think is true, false. Attitudes, what we like and dislike. And values, what we think is right, wrong, or good, bad. Jury members are expected to express thoughts based on reported observations to help reach a conclusion about someone's guilt or innocence. A juror might express the following thought: "The neighbor who saw the car leaving the night of the crime seemed credible, and the defendant seemed to have a shady past. I think he's trying to hide something." Sometimes people intentionally or unintentionally express thoughts as if they were feelings. For example, when people say, "I feel like you're too strict with your attendance policy," they aren't really expressing a feeling, they are expressing a judgment about the other person, a thought. Heading: Expressing feelings. When we express feelings, we communicate our emotions. Expressing feelings is a difficult part of verbal communication because there are many social norms about how, why, when, where, and to whom we express our emotions. Norms for emotional expression also vary based on nationality and other cultural identities and characteristics, such as age and gender. In terms of age, young children are typically freer to express positive and negative emotions in public. Gendered elements intersect with age as boys grow older and are socialized into a norm of emotional restraint. Although individual men vary in the degree in which they are emotionally expressive, there is still a prevailing social norm that encourages and even expects women to be more emotionally expressive than men. Expressing feelings can be uncomfortable for those listening. Some people are generally not good at or comfortable with receiving and processing other people's feelings. Even those with good empathetic listening skills can be positively or negatively affected by others' emotions. Expressions of anger can be especially difficult to manage because they represent a threat to the face and self esteem of others. Despite the fact that expressing feelings is more complicated than other forms of expression, emotional sharing is an important part of how we create social bonds and empathize with others, and it can be improved. In order to verbally express our emotions, it is important that we develop an emotional vocabulary. The more specific we can be when we are verbally communicating our emotions, the less ambiguous our emotions will be for the right person decoding our message. As we expand our emotional vocabulary, we are able to convey the intensity of the emotion we're feeling, whether it is mild, moderate, or intense. For example, happy is mild, delighted is moderate, and ecstatic is intense. Ignored is mild, rejected is moderate, and abandoned is intense. In a time when so much of our communication is electronically mediated, it is likely that we will communicate emotions through the written word in an email text or instant message. We may also still use pen and paper when sending someone a thank you note, a birthday card, or a sympathy card. Communicating emotions through the written or typed word can have advantages such as time to compose your thoughts and convey the details of what you're feeling. There are also disadvantages in that important context and nonverbal communication can't be included. Things like facial expressions and tone of voice offer much insight into emotions that may not be expressed verbally. There is also a lack of immediate feedback. Sometimes people respond immediately to a text or email, but think about how frustrating it is when you text someone and they don't get back to you right away. If you're in need of emotional support or want validation of an emotional message you just sent, waiting for a response could end up negatively affecting your emotional state. Heading: Expressing needs. When we express needs, we are communicating in an instrumental way to get us or help us get things done. Since we almost always know our needs more than others do, it's important for us to be able to convey those needs to others. Expressing needs can help us get a project done or work to help us navigate the changes of long term romantic partnership. Not expressing needs can lead to feelings of abandonment, frustration, or resentment. For example, if one romantic partner expresses the following thought, I think we're moving too quickly in our relationship, but doesn't also express a need, the other person in the relationship doesn't have a guide for what to do in response to the expressed thought, stating, I need to spend some time with my hometown friends this weekend. Would you mind if I went home by myself? Would likely make the expression more effective. Be cautious of letting evaluations or judgments sneak into your expressions of need. Saying, I need you to stop suffocating me, really expresses a thought feeling mixture more than you need. Heading: Language is powerful. The contemporary American philosopher David Abram wrote, only if words are felt, bodily presences like echoes or waterfalls, can we understand the power of spoken language to influence, alter, and transform the perceptual world. This statement encapsulates many of the powerful features of language. Next, we will discuss how language expresses our identities. Heading: Language expresses our identities. In the opening to this chapter, I recounted how an undergraduate class in semantics solidified my love of language. I could have continued on to say that I have come to think of myself as a word nerd. Words or phrases like that express who we are and contribute to the impressions that others make of us. We've already learned about identity needs and impression management and how we all use verbal communication strategically to create a desired impression. But how might the label word nerd affect me differently if someone else placed it on me? The power of language to express our identities varies depending on the origin of the label, self chosen or other imposed, and the context. People are usually comfortable with the language they use to describe their own identities, but may have issues with the labels others place on them. In terms of context, many people express their Irish identity on St. Patrick's Day, but they may not think much about it over the rest of the year. There are many examples of people who have taken a label that was imposed on them, one that usually has negative connotations, and intentionally used it in ways that counter previous meanings. Some country music singers and comedians have reclaimed the label redneck, using it as an identity marker they are proud of rather than a pejorative term. Other examples of people reclaiming identity labels is the Black is Beautiful movement of the 60s that repositioned Black as a positive identity marker for African Americans, and the queer movement of the 1980s and 90s that reclaimed queer as a positive identity marker for some gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. Even though some people embrace reclaimed words, they still carry their negative connotations and are not openly accepted by everyone. Heading: Language affects our credibility. One of the goals of this chapter is to help you be more competent with your verbal communication. People make assumptions about your credibility based on how you speak and what you say. Even though we've learned that meaning is in people rather than words, and that the rules that govern verbal communication, like rules of grammar, are arbitrary, these norms still mean something. You don't have to be a perfect grammarian to be perceived as credible. In fact, if you followed the grammar rules for written communication to the letter, you would actually sound pretty strange, since our typical way of speaking isn't as formal and structured as writing. But you still have to support your ideas and explain your conclusions you make to be seen as competent. You have to use language clearly and be accountable for what you say in order to be seen as trustworthy. Using informal language and breaking social norms we've discussed so far wouldn't enhance your credibility during a professional job interview, but it might with your friends at a tailgate party. Politicians know that the way they speak affects their credibility, but they also know that using words that are too scientific or academic can lead people to perceive them as eggheads, which would hurt their credibility. Politicians and many others in leadership positions need to be able to use language to put people at ease, relate to others, and still appear confident and competent. Heading: Language is a means of control. Control is a word that has negative connotations, but our use of it here can be positive, neutral, or negative. Verbal communication can be used to reward and punish. We can offer verbal communication in the form of positive reinforcement to praise someone. We can withhold verbal communication or use it in a critical, aggressive, or hurtful way as a form of negative reinforcement. Directives are utterances that try to get another person to do something. They can range from a rather polite ask or request to a more forceful command or insist. Context informs when and how we express directives and how people respond to them. Promises are often paired with directives in order to persuade people to comply, and those promises, whether implied or stated, should be kept in order to be an ethical communicator. Keep this in mind to avoid arousing false expectations on the part of the other person. Rather than verbal communication being directed at one person as a means of control, the way we talk creates overall climates of communication that may control many. Verbal communication, characterized by empathy, understanding, respect, and honesty, creates open climates that lead to more collaboration and more information exchange. Verbal communication that is controlling, deceitful, and vague creates a closed climate in which people are less willing to communicate and less trusting. Heading: Language is performative. Some language is actually more like an action than a packet of information. Saying, I promise, I guarantee, or I pledge does more than convey meaning. It communicates intent. Such utterances are called commissives, as they mean a speaker is committed to a certain course of action. Of course, promises can be broken, and there can be consequences, but other verbal communication is granted official power that can guarantee action. The two simple words, I do, can mean that a person has agreed to an oath before taking a witness stand or assuming the presidency. It can also mean that two people are now bound in a relationship, recognized by the government and or a religious community. These two words, if said in the right context in front of the right person, such as a judge or a reverend, bring with them obligations that cannot be undone without additional steps and potential negative repercussions. In that sense, language is much more than mere words. 3.2.5 Performative language can also be a means of control, especially in legal contexts. In some cases, the language that makes our laws is intentionally vague. In courts all over the nation, the written language intersects with spoken language as lawyers advocate for particular interpretations of the written law. The utterances of judges and juries set precedents for reasonable interpretations that will then help decide future cases. Imagine how powerful the words, we, the jury, find the defendant, seem to the defendant awaiting his or her verdict. The sentences handed down by judges following a verdict are also performative because those words impose fines, penalties, or even death. Some language is deemed so powerful that it is regulated. Hate speech, which we will learn about more later, and slander, libel, and defamation are considered powerful enough to actually do damage to a person and have therefore been criminalized. Heading: Language is fun. Word games have long been popular. Before words with friends, there was apples to apples, boggle, Scrabble, and crossword puzzles. Writers, poets, and comedians have built careers on their ability to have fun with language and in turn share that fun with others. The fun and frivolity of language becomes clear as teachers get half hearted laughs from students when they make puns. Jay Leno has a whole bit where he shows the hilarious mistakes people unintentionally make when they employ language. And people vie to construct the longest palindromic sentence. That's a sentence that has the same letters backward and forward. The productivity and limitlessness of language we discussed earlier leads some people to spend an inordinate amount of time discovering things about words. Two examples that I have found fascinating are palindromes and contronyms. Palindromes, as noted, are words that read the same from left to right and from right to left. Race car is a commonly cited example, but a little time spent looking through Google results for palindromes exposes many more, ranging from live not on evil to doc, note, I dissent. A fast never prevents a fatness. I diet on cod. Contronyms are words that have multiple meanings, two of which are opposites. For example, sanction can mean to allow and to prevent, and dust can mean to remove particles when used in reference to furniture, or to add particles when used in reference to a cake. These are just two examples of humorous and contradictory features of the English language. The book Crazy English by Richard Lederer explores dozens more. A fun aspect of language enjoyed by more people than a small community of word enthusiasts is humor. There are more than 100 theories of humor, but none of them quite captures the complex and often contradictory nature of what we find funny. Humor is a complicated social phenomenon that is largely based on the relationship between language and meaning. Humor functions to liven up conversations, break the ice, and increase group cohesion. We also use humor to test our compatibility with others when a deep conversation about certain topics, like politics or religion, would be awkward. Bringing up these topics in a lighthearted way can give us indirect information about another person's beliefs, attitudes, and values. Based on their response to the humorous message, we can either probe further or change the subject and write it off as a poor attempt at humor. Using humor also draws attention to us, and the reactions that we get from others feeds into our self concept. We also use humor to disclose information about ourselves that we might not feel comfortable revealing in a more straightforward way. Humor can also be used to express sexual interest or to cope with bad news or bad situations. We first start to develop an understanding of humor as children when we realize that the words we use for objects are really arbitrary and can be manipulated. This manipulation creates a distortion or incongruous moment in the reality that we had previously known. Some humor scholars believe that this early wordplay, for example, calling a horse a turtle and a turtle a horse, leads us to appreciate language based humor like puns and riddles. It is in the process of encoding and decoding that humor emerges. People use encoding to decide how and when to use humor, and people use decoding to make sense of humorous communication. Things can go wrong in both of those processes. I'm sure we can all relate to the experience of witnessing a poorly timed or executed joke, a problem with encoding, and of not getting a joke, a problem with decoding. Heading: Language is dynamic. As we already learned, language is essentially limitless. We may create a one of a kind sentence combining words in new ways and never know it. Aside from the endless structural possibilities, words change meaning, and new words are created daily. In this section, we'll learn more about the dynamic nature of language by focusing on neologisms and slang. Heading: Neologisms. Neologisms are newly coined or used words. Newly coined words are those that were just brought into linguistic existence. Newly used words make their way into languages in several ways, including borrowing and changing structure. Taking is actually a more fitting descriptor than borrowing, since we take words that don't really give them back. In any case, borrowing is the primary means through which languages expand. English is a good case in point, as most of its vocabulary is borrowed and doesn't reflect the language's Germanic origins. English has been called the vacuum cleaner of languages. Weekend is a popular English word based on the number of languages that have borrowed it. We have borrowed many, many words, like chic from the French, karaoke from the Japanese, and caravan from Arabic. Structural changes also lead to new words. Compound words are neologisms that are created by joining two already known words: keyboard, newspaper, and gift card. They are all compound words that were formed when new things were created or conceived. We also create new words by adding something, subtracting something, or blending them together. For example, we can add affixes, meaning a prefix or a suffix, to a word. Affixing usually alters the original meaning, but doesn't completely change it. Ex husband and kitchenette are relatively recent examples of such changes. New words are also formed when clipping a word, like examination, which creates a new word, exam, that retains the same meaning. And last, we can form new words by blending old ones together. Words like breakfast and lunch blend letters and meaning to form a new word, brunch. Existing words also change in their use and meaning. The digital age has given rise to some interesting changes in word usage. Before Facebook, the word friend had many meanings, but it was mostly used as a noun referring to a companion. The sentence, I'll friend you, wouldn't have made sense to many people just a few years ago because friend wasn't used as a verb. Google went from being a proper noun referring to a company to a more general verb that refers to searching for something on the internet, perhaps not even using the Google search engine. Meanings can expand or contract without changing from a noun to a verb. Gay An adjective for feeling happy, expanded to include gay as an adjective describing a person's sexual orientation. Perhaps because of the confusion that this caused, the meaning of gay has contracted again, as the earlier meaning is now considered archaic, meaning it is no longer in common usage. The American Dialect Society names an overall word of the year each year and selects winners in several more specific categories. The winning words are usually new words or words that recently took on new meaning. In 2010, the overall winner was Occupy as a result of the Occupy Wall Street movement. The word named the most likely to succeed was cloud as a result of Apple unveiling its new online space for file storage and retrieval. Although languages are dying out at an alarming rate, many languages are growing in terms of new words and expanded meanings, thanks largely to advances in technology, as can be seen in the example of cloud. Heading: Slang. Slang is a great example of the dynamic nature of language. Slang refers to new or adapted words that are specific to a group, context, and or time period. Regarded as less formal, the representative of people's creative play with language. Research has shown that only about 10% of the slang terms that emerge over a 15-year period survive. Many more take their place, though, as new slang words are created using inversion, reduction, or old fashioned creativity. Inversion is a form of wordplay that produces slang words like sick, wicked, and bad that refer to the opposite of their typical meaning. Reduction creates slang words such as pick, sec, and later from picture, second, and see you later. New slang words often represent what is edgy, current, or simply relevant in the daily lives of a group of people. Many creative examples of slang refer to illegal or socially taboo topics like sex, drinking, and drugs. It makes sense that developing an alternative way to identify drugs or talk about taboo topics could make life easier for the people who partake in such activities. Slang allows people who are in the know to break the code and presents a linguistic barrier for unwanted outsiders. Taking a moment to think about the amount of slang that refers to being intoxicated on drugs or alcohol or engaging in sexual activity should generate a lengthy list. When I first started teaching this course in the early 2000s, Cal Poly Pomona had been compiling a list of the top 20 college slang words of the year for a few years. The top slang word for 1997 was da bomb, which means great, awesome, or extremely cool. And the top word for 2001 and 2002 was tight, which is used as a generic positive meaning attractive, nice, or cool. Unfortunately, the project didn't continue, but I still enjoy seeing how the top slang words change and sometimes recycle and come back. I always end up learning some new words for my students. When I ask a class what the top college slang word should be for 2011, they suggested deuces, which is used when leaving an alternative to goodbye and stems from another verbal and nonverbal leaving symbol, holding up two fingers for peace, as if to say, peace out. It's difficult for my students to identify the slang they use at any given moment because it is worked into our everyday language patterns and becomes very natural. Just as we learned here, new words can create a lot of buzz and become a part of common usage very quickly. The same can happen with new slang terms. Most slang terms also disappear quickly, and their alternative meaning fades into obscurity. For example, you don't hear anyone using the word macaroni to refer to someone cool or fashionable. But that's exactly what the common slang meaning of the word was at the time the song Yankee Doodle was written. Yankee Doodle isn't saying the feather he sticks in his cap is small, curved pasta shell. He is saying it's cool or stylish. 3.2.8 Heading: Language is relational. We use verbal communication to initiate, maintain, and terminate our interpersonal relationships. The first few exchanges with a potential romantic partner or friend help us size up the other person and figure out if we want to pursue a relationship or not. We then use verbal communication to remind others how we feel about them and to check in with them, engaging in relationship maintenance through language use. When negative feelings arrive and persist, or for many other reasons, we often use verbal communication to end a relationship. Heading: Language can bring us together. Interpersonally, verbal communication is key to bringing people together and maintaining relationships. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, our use of words like I, you, we, our, and us affect our relationships. We language includes the words we, our, and us, and can be used to promote a feeling of inclusiveness. I language can be useful when expressing thoughts, needs, and feelings because it leads us to own our expressions and avoid the tendency to mistakenly attribute the cause of our thoughts, needs, and feelings to others. Communicating emotions using I language may also facilitate emotion sharing by not making our conversational partner feel at fault or defensive. For example, instead of saying, "You're making me crazy," you could say, "I'm starting to feel really anxious because we can't make a decision about this." Conversely, you language can lead people to become defensive and feel attacked, which could be divisive and result in feelings of interpersonal separation. Aside from the specific words that we use, the frequency of communication impacts relationships. Of course, the content of what is said is important, but research shows that romantic partners who communicate frequently with each other and with mutual friends and family members experience less stress and uncertainty in their relationship and are more likely to stay together. When frequent communication combines with supportive changes and messages, which are messages communicated in an open, honest, and non confrontational way, people are sure to come together. Moving from the interpersonal to the sociocultural level, we can see that speaking the same language can bring people together. When a person is surrounded by people who do not speak his or her native language, it can be very comforting to run into another person who speaks the same language. Even if the two people are strangers, the ease of linguistic compatibility is comforting and can quickly facilitate a social bond. We've already learned that language helps shape our social reality, so a common language leads to some similar perspectives. Of course, there are individual differences within a language community, but the power of shared language to unite people has led to universal language movements that advocate for one global language. Serious attempts to create a common language, sometimes referred to as lingua franca or auxiliary language, began in the 1600s as world exploration brought increased trade, and Latin was no longer effective as the language of international business. Since then, hundreds of auxiliary languages have been recorded, but none have achieved widespread international usage or been officially recognized as an international language. While some such movements were primarily motivated by business and profit, others hope to promote mutual understanding, more effective diplomacy, and peaceful coexistence. Esperanto, which means hopeful, is the most well known and widely used auxiliary language that was intended to serve as a common international language. Esperanto was invented by a Polish eye doctor at the end of the 1800s, and today has been has between 1 and 2 million fluent speakers worldwide. Many works of literature and important manuscripts like the Bible and the Quran have been translated into Esperanto, and many original works of literature and academic articles have been written in the language. Some countries also broadcast radio programs in Esperanto. Several barriers will have to be overcome in order for auxiliary language like Esperanto to gain international acceptance. First, there would have to be a massive effort to put into a period of simultaneous learning. Otherwise, it is difficult to motivate people to learn a language that is not necessary for their daily lives and that no one else speaks. Second, as we have learned, people take pride in their linguistic identity and find pleasure in playing with the rules of language, creatively inventing new words and meanings that constantly change a language. Such changes may be impossible to accommodate in an auxiliary language. Lastly, the optimism of an internationally shared language eventually gives way to realism. If a shared language really brings peaceful coexistence, how do we explain all the civil wars and other conflicts that have been fought between people who speak the same language? As new languages are invented, many more languages are dying. Linguists and native speakers of endangered languages have also rallied around so called dying languages to preserve them. In the United States, Cajun French in Louisiana, French Canadian in Maine, and Pennsylvania Dutch are examples of language communities that are in danger of losing the language that has united them, in some cases for hundreds of years. Although American English is in no danger of dying soon, there have been multiple attempts to make English the official language of the United States. Sometimes the argument supporting this proposition seems to be based on the notion that a shared language will lead to more solidarity and in group identification among the speakers. However, many of these movements are politically and ideologically motivated and actually seek to marginalize and or expel immigrants, typically immigrants who are also people of color. The United States isn't the only country that has debated the merits of officially recognizing only certain languages. Similar debates have been going on for many years regarding whether French, English, or both should be the official language in Quebec, Canada, and which languages, such as French, Dutch, or Flemish, should be used in what contexts in Belgium. In such cases, we can see that verbal communication can also divide people. Heading: Language can separate us. Whether it's criticism, teasing, or language differences, verbal communication can also lead to feelings of separation. Language differences alone do not present insurmountable barriers. We can learn other languages with time and effort. There are other people who can translate and serve as bridges across languages. And we can also communicate quite a lot nonverbally in the absence of linguistic compatibility. People who speak the same language can intentionally or use language to separate. The words us and them can be a powerful start to separation. Think of how language played a role in segregation in the United States as the notion of separate but equal was upheld by the Supreme Court, and how apartheid affected South Africa as limits based on finances and education were placed on the Black majority's rights to vote. Symbols, both words and images, were a very important part of Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. Various combinations of colored stars, triangles, letters, and other symbols were sewn into the clothing or uniforms of people persecuted by the Nazis in order to classify them. People were labeled and reduced to certain characteristics rather than seen as complete humans, which facilitated the Nazis' oppression, violence, and killing. At the interpersonal level, unsupportive messages can make others respond defensively, which can lead to feelings of separation and actual separation or disillusion of a relationship. It's impossible to be supportive in our communication all the time, but consistently unsupportive messages can hurt others' self esteem, escalate conflict, and lead to defensiveness. People who regularly use unsupportive messages may create a toxic win lose climate in a relationship. 6 verbal tactics that can lead to feelings of defensiveness and separation are global labels: sarcasm, dragging up the past, negative comparisons, judgmental you messages, and threats. Common types of unsupportive messages. Global labels. Number 1, you're a liar. Labeling someone irresponsible, untrustworthy, selfish, or lazy calls his or her whole identity as a person into question. Such sweeping judgments and generalizations are sure to only escalate a negative situation. Sarcasm. Number 2, no, you didn't miss anything in class on Wednesday. We just sat here and looked at each other. Even though sarcasm is often disguised as humor, it usually represents passive aggressive behavior through which a person indirectly communicates negative feelings. Dragging up the past. Number 3, I should have known not to trust you when you never paid me back that $100 I let you borrow. Bringing up negative past experiences is a tactic used by people when they don't want to discuss a current situation. Sometimes people have built up negative feelings that are suddenly let out by a seemingly small thing in a moment. Negative comparisons. Number 4. Jade graduated from college without any credit card debt. I guess you're just not as responsible as her. Holding a person up to the supposed standards or characteristics of another person can lead to feelings of inferiority and resentment. Parents and teachers may unfairly compare children to their siblings. Judgmental you messages. Number 5. You're never going to be able to hold down a job. Accusatory messages are usually generalized overstatements about another person that go beyond labeling, but still do not describe specific behavior in a productive way. Threats. Number 6. If you don't stop texting back and forth with your ex, both of you are going to regret it. Threatening someone with violence or some other negative consequence usually signals the end of productive communication. Aside from the potential legal consequences, threats usually overcompensate for a person's insecurity.